Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I am very happy to tell you that we have no sound issues whatsoever this evening. And I'm Hélène Podliasky, the Events Director for Oblong Books. Before I welcome our guests this evening, I have a few instructions for those of you who've not attended one of our virtual events before. If you have questions at any time during the program, you may enter them in the chat, which you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. There's also a little module that says Ask a Question that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and you can enter questions in there too. For those of you who would like to purchase a signed copy of the Nine, there's a green Buy the Book button link at the bottom of your screen. We couldn't be more delighted this evening to be hosting Gwen Strauss for her new book, The Nine, which is out this month from St. Martin's Press. The Nine tells the heart-stopping true story of Gwen's great-aunt, Hélène Podliasky, who led a band of 9 female resistance fighters as they escaped a German forced labor camp. Gwen Strauss's poems, short stories, and essays have appeared in the New Republic, the London Sunday Times, the New England Review, and Kenyon Review, and others. And she is the author of the collection of poetry, Trail of Stones. Born in Haiti, Gwen now lives in southern France, where she's the director of the Artists' Residency Program at the Dora Maar House. Welcome, Gwen. Conducting the conversation with Gwen this evening, we're pleased to welcome award-winning journalist Lauren Sandler. Lauren's work has appeared in Time, the New York Times, Slate, The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Republic, The Guardian, New York Magazine, Elle, and more. She's been on staff at Salon and at NPR, where she worked on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, and The Cultural Desk. Lauren is also the author of This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home, which has just been released in paperback this week, and the best-selling One and Only, The Freedom of Having an Only Child. Welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you here this evening. I'm going to hand over to you, Lauren.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here and to be here with Gwen. Gwen is speaking to us from France, from her gorgeous farmhouse in Provence, where it is 1 o'clock in the morning. So for those of you who were with us last time, imagine Gwen's 1 o'clock in the morning last time, but this time we have working sound, and I have a
it works
wine. And I'm so excited to talk about this book. When I first met Gwen at the Maison Dora Maar in France, and she told me that she was writing a book. You know, people always tell you that they're writing a book, but when Gwen told me about this book, I actually, it's a cliche, but I do believe that my jaw dropped. And all I wanted to do was hear every possible thing that she could tell me about what we now all get to read in this total marvel of a book. You may have read the Wall Street Journal review, like the ornery Wall Street Journal was just breathlessly raving about this book for very, very good reason. And Gwen, I would love to kick us off by asking you the same question that the editors of Time Magazine asked you, which is, how did you come to write this?
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. And actually, I'm just so thrilled to, thank you for coming the second time, for both evenings. And also thank you, Oblong, for having me. It's really, as I said, it's really my favorite bookstore, and I feel so thrilled. So the answer to that question, it was a long process. It was a long, I think when my aunt told me the story, she told it to me over lunch in 2002. And I knew that it was an important story, and I knew that it was something she hadn't really talked about. So I asked her if I could record it and come back and record it, which I did. And then my other aunt, we made a transcript. And then it just sort of percolated in my mind for a long time because I had children, I had a job, I was moving countries. And I thought I would come back and write it. I thought I'd make it into a novel. I thought I would, but there wasn't enough elements, the story she told didn't really hold together. I mean, it did, and so slowly over time, what happened was I found other parts of the story. I discovered a book that was written by another woman in the story. And then I found, it was like I suddenly had several points of view. And that's really interesting to have the different points of view of this one story.
It's fascinating to me because, so often with nonfiction, people will often ask, especially editors, well, why isn't it just a magazine article? And this is one of these books that you hold it and you read it and it feels like this is a book. Like, it's incredible that you were even able to contain what you did inside this book. But can you start off telling us about what your Aunt Hélène told you that day during that lunch, and how old she was?
Yeah, she was 80 at the time when she told me. So she was talking about, or she was in her 80s. She was talking about something that had happened 60 years earlier when she was 23. And it was, like I said earlier, it was something that she didn't talk about. Possibly she talked about with her husband, maybe with a few friends, but I think pretty much no one, certainly not her daughter. And she told me, I wish I can remember how it came up, because it was so kind of startling when she started to talk about it. But she just said that she was in, I think I might have asked her, she was in the resistance. I knew that because she'd gotten, she had a bunch of medals on the Légion d'honneur and anyway, plusieurs. And she said, she started talking about how she waited for the planes to drop parachute materials and she was setting up the terrain in Normandy. And then she talked about how she was arrested. And then she talked about, and suddenly, and then she said, she escaped from a camp with these group of other women. And that was when I thought, what? That's crazy, So that was really when I thought, this is interesting. But at the time, she couldn't remember who the other women were. She didn't have any other names. She couldn't really remember exactly where they had escaped from. She had it a little bit wrong. She thought they were in Buchenwald, which they never went to. So there were parts of her story that didn't hold together until I found other versions of the story from other people, and then the historical record.
I very much want to talk about where you felt you could diverge from that. But first, I just want to say it's an extraordinary work of reporting and of just rigor and diligence and patience.
Oh,
and
thank you.
I was wondering if you could tell us about your process of gathering the material that would become the source of the book.
What you said earlier was true. I thought it was going to be an essay. I mean, I really thought it was going to be a 5-page essay or something like that, And I went to, it was finally what really sort of kicked me off was when the election, and I wanted to go to Germany to retrace the route. It was something I'd always thought, like, if I could go from village to village, and that could be kind of a story, the story of me doing this route, and and I took my daughter Sophie with me. We had never really spent time in Germany, even though we're German citizens, and so she was up for it. It was January; it was really cold. I think when I started that, it became kind of clear to me that this wasn't an essay. The moment that became clear to me was when, so we went to the Leipzig labor camp where they had been before they went out on the death march, the women, there's 9 women, these friends at that point. And it's a little trail. Now it's like a kind of ecological scientific park, and you can't really get into it. And I had to go, at one point, it was kind of funny because to get into it, I had to like tailgate this other car and go through this, barrier because I didn't have the code. And Sophie was like, no. And I said, listen, they kept her here in a prison camp. We get to come in. Like, I was really fierce about it. And I found in the corner of this big complex, which had been the former prison camp, this little trailer that was a museum. And I went in and, it was teeny. It's like there was an archivist there. I started to talk to her, and she said, well, let me see if I can find your aunt. And I gave her the name and the birth date and what I knew. And at the time she couldn't, but because we had to go. But the next day she emailed me the Nazi list. And it was so powerful to suddenly see her name on this list, and I don't know, just kind of made it really real. And then that day we went to a camp. Sophie and I went to Buchenwald, which is the first time I'd ever been to a camp. And that's also when I realized, like, okay, I can't just make this a simple essay. It has to be more. Did I answer your question? I don't even know if I answered.
Absolutely. But like with the book, everything feels like every sentence in this book makes me want to have 10 questions with you. 10 conversations with you. So
it took me a while before I started interviewing people because I was shy about that.
So one of the things that, as a reporter myself, I I like gasped when I was reading the book, just from a reporting perspective, is you at one point say, okay, so I knew that there were these women who Hélène was with. I knew that they had escaped this camp, but they all had false names. And I somehow had to figure out who they were.
Yeah.
What was the process? How did you do that?
Yeah, actually, that was super fun in a weird way, because it started with that list. And I was just kind of looking at the names, and it was, you know, and in that list, in the initial list, I did find right below Hélène, the woman that had written the Suzanne Maudet, who was the woman Zaza who wrote the book that was published a few years after I interviewed Hélène. And then I found another woman on that list, was Gigi, because her name was so obvious. You know, it was Gigi. There was Gigi. It was Guillemette, but I could figure out that must be her. And then there was one other one. So I realized I found 4 names on that list so I could find their last names and everything. But then it was really detective work, and it was kind of this weird, I would stare at that list over and over again, and then I got other lists, and I got other documents, and then I had this sort of a miraculous trip to the archives in Paris, where I found the original of the list, which had margin notes and had annexes, which then helped me figure out why 2 people were missing, you know. But it was, and some of the people I didn't figure out until I started interviewing the families. One of them, Mena, for example, her nom de guerre has nothing to do with her real name. Her real name's Yvonne. So at one point when I was talking to Gigi's family, I said, do you know who Mena was? And then they knew who she was, and they could tell me. And there was, you know, it was sort of like that. The last one that was really hard for me was José. I thought she was someone else. And it was, I learned all about another person that I thought was her. But yeah, it was fun.
We have these 9 women, but then there are all of these other stories, like all these different ways that you let us know that, yes, this is a really closely observed story of 9 women, but this is also the story of hundreds of thousands.
It's a bigger story.
And one of the ways that you do that, when you mentioned your trip to the archives, it just reminded me, you tell us this little story about Odette and how Odette sort of permission to write this book. Will you tell us about that?
Yeah, no, she's amazing. And I actually, could write a separate thing about her, I think. She's this incredible person, but I didn't know that. When I had never been to the archives before, I'd never been in an archives before. I was kind of intimidated by the whole process. So it took me a long time to get up my courage to do that. But I have a Dormar friend who works in archives all the time. She just kept saying, you got to just go to the archives. You got to do this. So, and you go online, you sign up, and you have to choose what you're going to look at online through this online inventory, which is enormous. It's all the history of France, and just the part of World War II is enormous, and just the part, concentration camps is enormous. So I just chose randomly the file of this woman named Odette Pilpol because she happened to be at Leipzig at the same time. Well, she was it turned out in the same block. I didn't know that. And by the time I actually got to the archives, because you have to reserve months in advance, by the time I actually got to Paris and got there, I'd sort of forgotten what I had reserved. I couldn't remember what I was supposed to, and I was, anyway, they roll out, and I had one of those things that happens. I think since then I've been to the archives many times and you don't find anything. But it was one of those times when they hand me the box, I open the box, I start going through this box, and there was the original list that I had been staring at for months and months and months, trying to figure out the women, who the women were and what their real names were. And that one that I had been sent to me by the archivist in Leipzig. And it was a photographed, scanned, rephotographed. It was a really minimally legible list. And this one here was completely legible because it was the original that she had stolen, and it had her notes. It was her handwriting, and next to my aunt's. So my aunt was known by the Nazis and by the other woman as Christine. And in all the records, she's known as Christine. And Odette had written next to my aunt's name, Hélène, which meant that she knew who she was, because even the other women in the group didn't know her real name. So they were friends. So when I saw that, I got like, it just felt like amazing that this would happen. And then this woman, Odette, her story and how she gets this list is kind of another incredible story, because she stays behind in the camps first of all, she was a born archivist. She was like making lists of people the whole time. She was recording who was sent to the gas chambers, she was getting everyone's address for people who didn't survive so she could tell their families. I mean, she was really bearing witness the whole time and making these lists in the camp with scraps of paper that she sewed together. So in that box were like these like little carnets that she had made herself out of camp paper, And then she stayed behind when everyone goes on the death march, when the rumor is that the whole camp is ringed with explosives and anyone who's left behind is going to die. So she risked her life to stay behind to steal the list, and it's a huge list. The whole list is about, 300 pages of names. So she's kind of this amazing, she's a hero to me. She's really incredible person.
I think it's so fascinating to think about the people who did choose to find ways to tell the stories. Obviously, Zaza, of course, for anyone who's read the book, we know that she, 2 years after these events that Gwen writes about, she sat down and wrote it down in a book, and nobody wanted to publish it until 2014.
Right.
Which, not to bring gender into everything, as I often do, but I just if it was Band of Brothers instead of Band of Sisters, like, wouldn't we already have the movie by now? But I am so curious about how it felt to tell an untold story. I think a lot about how defining the stories like the ones that you tell and how many of them there are out there and how few of them were actually told, because of course you could only tell them if you were a survivor, and if you were a survivor there was so much guilt, so much trauma. If you weren't a survivor, obviously you were in the majority to tell. And so I wonder how you think about what it costs us to have these stories untold.
Yeah, it's a really good question. First of all, I think that a lot of the women, especially these younger women, felt ashamed to have survived, and also they were kind of taboo. And like I think I've said in other places, marriages were called off if it was found out that a woman was a survivor from the camp. I mean, it was really something that you just didn't talk about. So there was this silence. A lot of the women did start talking about it as there started to be later, as they became Holocaust deniers, and they said that they started talking about it because they didn't want the people who had died to be forgotten. So they wanted to honor the dead, the ones who hadn't survived. I think a lot of the women, what I found in my research as I was interviewing the families, they ended up talking about their stories sort of late in life. And usually not with their immediate family, usually with someone distant, like a niece, like me, or a nephew, like Zaza did. And I think, I felt a little bit like they were ready for those stories to be told at that point. It's kind of interesting, because you want to also respect their, for example, and this is Zaza tells the story, but she doesn't give their names. She doesn't give their full names. So she's protecting them. I think when she wrote her manuscript, it was immediately after the war, and I think she felt like if she shouldn't say their names, it could shame them. So there was a kind of a way that you have to sort of also respect a little bit, but yeah, I think it was really hard at first for me because I felt like I was breaking a taboo. Like I felt like, is this really my story to tell? Am I really allowed to do this? What is? And then, there was parts where I had to decide what happened because there were so many different versions. But I think at the end of the day, I've heard from some of the families that they're really happy. So that makes me happy, that these stories get told. And I think that the stories need to be told because, it's the truth. It's our stories. What if we don't tell these stories? Who are we? I mean,
it is something that I've been thinking a lot as that generation has vanished.
Right.
You have this conversation with Hélène. It's the last time you talked to her about it. What it means to seek out these stories. I just know with my own grandfather who did not live through the Holocaust because he was one of the lucky ones who escaped from Krakow before it happened.
Right.
I would ask him questions even about what it was like to witness it from the United States, and he would say, "Why would you want to talk about that?"
Yeah.
So, you're right. It was such a taboo. And yet I worry about what that degree of trauma has cost us, especially as we were moving into waves of anti-Semitism, as we are moving into, new waves of defining what human rights are and can be in the world. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this book is you don't write as a Jewish story. It's not a Jewish story that you're telling. You're telling stories of women in the resistance who were not necessarily were from Jewish. I'm trying.
Two of them were Jewish. So Nicole was Jewish, but she kept that hidden. And my aunt was partly Jewish. Her father was Jewish. So but they were raised not Jewish. Yeah.
It's so interesting to read a Holocaust book about a group of women who aren't Jewish, and who find themselves in the position that they're in because they fought back, and they fought hard, and it was scary and dangerous to fight hard. And I wonder, in this sort of moment when resistance has become such a hashtag and such a buzzword, and with like Princess Leia t-shirts to signify their resistance, and people talk about voting as a resistance. Like, no, voting is citizenship. What these women did is resistance.
Actually, just real quickly.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Go on.
No, just that the women, when they were arrested, they were charged as terrorists. I mean, that was their crime. So interesting, Anyway, sorry, go on.
Well, and I mean, I think that's not hard for us to imagine right now.
Right.
In a way that maybe when you started having conversations around this book, it would have been harder to imagine. And it does make me think about what it means that we have these stories locked away in the archives that resist narrative, that are, hidden in graves at the moment. And there's, in the beginning of the book, you write about, you have this brilliant passage about numbers and how we know how to think. And you write about how, perhaps our thinking limits our understanding, and about the importance of deeply understanding this. And this is part of where I think you make a jump that a lot of journalists or historians would be terrified to make, which is, it feels like this book is dedicated to understanding something as a narrative human experience, where of course you weren't there. You weren't there with a tape recorder as they were on the Death March, or as they were finding, uncooked potatoes on the ground, or as they were trying to organize their clothing so that they would look like people who hadn't escaped from the camps or were laughing with each other. That had to come somewhere. And that, I think, is the deeper understanding of the book, is you giving yourself permission to say, okay, there are things that I know. There are things that I prove that exist on paper, that I found in the archives, that I have on tape. And then there are the things that I know about these landscapes, about how we talk to each other. And I wonder what it was like for you to make that jump. It was moves from like the historical record into this book, which is just propulsive narrative. We have dialogue, we have description. It's incredible.
I guess I finally gave myself permission to do that after reading. Well, first of all, I knew that's the kind of book I could write. I felt like if I couldn't stay with just this very limited, well, not limited, but a different kind of way of voice. It's not my voice in a way. I also felt like, because I gave myself permission, because the women were so much in the margins and so much not part of the archive. In a lot of ways, other marginalized people have been, indigenous people, enslaved people. And in order for them to tell their stories, they have to give themselves the freedom to imagine the story. Otherwise, it's a further cruelty. Like, already the first thing is that the archive didn't count them. They didn't think that they were that important. And then the second cruelty is like, well, you're not allowed to say anything or write anything or have a story unless it's really like this part of this, the big historical archive. So, Celia Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Stories, Wayward Lives, I think is the title. She has a great introduction to that, where she talks about, because her book, when I read her book, it really helped me kind of like freed me a little bit, because she said, she's writing about these women in Harlem in the 30s and 40s and 50s who are being arrested and thrown into jail. And basically she's writing about threads, like she has so little to go on, but she imagines into their lives, and she kind of allows them to have agency, allows them to have stories, allows them to be vibrant, allows them to be alive, and instead of just this kind of police blotter, reductive, and that's really what they would have stayed if you don't, so that's how I gave myself permission. Whether that's a rationalization or not, I don't know, but I just feel like it's very important to allow to allow these people to have full, breathing existence. And narrative to me is really, I love narrative. I love storytelling. I love gossip. I mean, I'm just, I'm human that way. So, that's my way my brain is. So that's the kind of story I could write. But yeah, and I try to say in the book, I imagine, or to give us some kind of hint when I'm, leaping into storytelling. But I always tried to stay as close as I could to the record and what I had found, and the tidbits here and there.
And I think
and in the end, I had a lot.
Difference between historical fiction and what you've done, because of course, good historical fiction is also well researched.
Right.
But this is so clearly a work of nonfiction, and I think that's it's something that you were really able to pull off. Was there tension around that?
Yeah, I mean, I did. I was really worried about it, and I went back and forth. I mean, there was one point I was going to do a novel, but at the same time, there was so much really beautiful things that I had found, that I really want. I don't know. So, and I also had a great editor, Elizabeth Disegard. I mean, she helped me a lot, really, really, in shaping it and in, threading that needle, and I felt I feel intimidated. I'm not a trained journalist. I'm not, I didn't. I feel like, it was hard for me. It was definitely something that I would, and so that was part of the reasons why I kept myself in the story somewhat. Like I wanted the reader to be aware that this is a person who's trying to figure this out, so that it's not some kind of authoritative, here is the story and it's the ultimate truth. I wanted, by putting myself in the story, I felt that would at least keep that clear, that I'm stumbling along, figuring it out.
Well, and the way that you do it, it feels like you're just sort of embroidering yourself through in this incredibly philosophical, very relatable way.
Oh, good. Thank you.
One of the things that I'm thinking about, which I was also thinking about when I was reading the book, is the historical record tends to be the record of men, right? It's the record of soldiers. It's the record of leaders. And part of why I think we don't have stories like this. And yes, you could have researched a novel and written a novel, and then that novel would never be treated as a work of history. And what I find so valuable about this book is it is a book about what women suffered, women suffered as resistors, what women suffered as just female-bodied human beings, what women suffered as sex workers, how many women, gave birth in the camps because of how many were raped. I mean, just the fear of men and of predatory men that the women have as they are sleeping. It feels really profound to me in a way that I never read anything quite like this about the Holocaust, and honestly, not even just the trauma, which, you have incredible details about the pounds of hair and the, the numbers of garments that were discovered at Auschwitz, and how many people showed up pregnant and what that process was, and how their pregnancies were, were rapes, etc. But there are also these elements of how the women talk about food, and how the women sex, and how the women talk about clothing, that just feels there's such a familiar tenderness in it. And there are moments in which they spar together. It's beautiful. And it is the thing that to me makes the untold history come alive in a way that I feel is and the Wall Street Journal felt this way too, that the rigor to make its case is nonfiction, and therefore opens up a whole avenue of nonfiction about women in this war. All these women in this war.
Yeah, actually, for me, the thank you for that. I think for me, the big discovery for me was Ravensbruck, that camp, which is the second largest camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. So it's not a small concentration camp. It was a huge camp. And that's the camp where basically all women went to, except for the ones who were sent directly to Auschwitz, Birkenau, and exterminated directly. Basically, any woman who was deported went through Ravensbruck. So it's the story of women in that war, and it was largely effaced. First of all, because it fell behind the Iron Curtain, and then became a part of the narrative of the Soviet Union about the communists, fight against the imperial West and the capitalist West. And they bulldozed the camp, and they were going to put up a shopping mall, and there was a huge fight to keep that site as a memorial site that was led by the survivors, many of the Polish survivors. But interestingly, again, the plight of Jewish women in that camp is really not very well told until really recently, like in Auschwitz. And there's the Trageda, which is a statue of a woman holding up another woman, is based on this Polish prisoner, Olga Benario, who was a communist, but she was actually killed there because she was Jewish. But that's not mentioned until very recently, So the story of, and it was, they denied that there were gas chambers. They denied that, they denied a lot of things about that camp for so long. And what happened to women, what happened to women's bodies, and again, all the babies that were born there. To me, that was a big part of a big revelation for me, and a big part of the story that I wanted to tell, because all the resistance women went through that camp when they were deported. So it's kind of, if you read any woman in the resistance, suddenly they'll say, and then she was sent to Ravensbrück. And then later she's sent to another camp, to the labor camps. They were all these satellite camps to build weaponry. But basically that's the central experience, I think, for women in World War II. And yeah.
After I read the book, I literally waved it at my family and said, "We don't know anything about Ravensbruck. Now we know something about Ravensbruck." I, of course, was pronouncing it. But it did make me think about how we have the camps that have become part of the conversation.
Right.
About how during the Passover Seder, we always had this tradition, and we carry it on still, where instead of just doing the 10 plagues, we list 10 camps. And this is not one of the camps that we ever had. Even though it's massive, even though it is the story of women in the Holocaust in so many ways.
Right.
Because I don't think we had that story in this way that you told us.
Right. No, it's a very that to me is a really important part of the puzzle for me, that was learning about that. And there's been some great books about it. And one of the women who is a survivor, Germaine Tillon, she was an anthropologist, and so she sort of took this anthropological notes while she was there and she ended up she survived really because she was in the offices. She was a sort of secretary. So there she had access to numbers, and she kept accounts of how much the Reich was making off of the labor of women. She was really, she's one of those incredible resources, one of the great survivors in camp. And there's been others. Yeah. Yeah.
I also, because the narrative feels so contemporary, the way you write these women just feels so, I feel so with them. And then you do the basic math. And as we all know, this is very recent history still.
Yeah.
And I just found myself just gutted by how much this history is not part of our cultural conversation. When we think about identity, when we think about basic human rights, when we think about the world that we are making on, the shards of a broken world, I just felt shocked page after page after page, how much, even as someone who tends to think about these things at times, how much it's not a part of my thinking.
Yeah, I think one of the things that sort of also shocked me when I was doing the research, because I was interviewing the family members, the descendants, all of the women had died. In fact, the last one who I figured out who she was had died like 6 months earlier when I figured out who she was. It's like this wave retreating, like, and I, of course, wish I had asked my aunt more questions. But as I was talking to the different family members, a lot of them the children have definitely signs or symptoms of transgenerational trauma. They've inherited a lot of the trauma of their parents, of their mothers and fathers often. And what I've realized, because it kept coming up, they were basically teenagers or in their 20s in 1968. So in 68 in France was a big time, and several of them had like a big revolt. They fought, they were part of that big 68 revolt. And they said, well, I was like my parents. And I just realized, like, oh, it's a direct thing. It's exactly, it's just that it's that generation later, and then you're suddenly revolting. Just you're being a resistance fighter, just like your mom or dad was. You're trying to carry on which was just an interest. I'd never done the math or figured out that was the connection generationally. So and when also, of course, women didn't get the right to vote in France until 1944. So that's really recently,
Mm-hmm.
And when I think it's in the book, I can't remember, but when Sophie and I first went to go visit Zaza, Zaza's nephew, who's the first other family I interviewed, happened to be the anniversary of World War I. And it was so clear, like World War I led to World War II, led to you just sort of felt this, and Zaza has a really tragic story of how her children were all very, suffered terribly from mental illness. And both of the parents were survivors. So it was like, it was this really stark lesson for me in how intergenerational trauma works, and and then I thought about, in America, hundreds of years of slavery, how much trauma, what are we all, it's really intense when you start to think about it, but we have to figure out,
So, of course, you were writing this book during the Trump era. You were writing this book. You talk in the book about how, the Bataclan happened and you go to the archives. I wonder how it felt to be telling these stories in front of the backdrop of how we live now and what we experience now, and how you've talked about Charlottesville. I wonder, not in this conversation, but in thinking about your travels in your writing, and I wonder what it feels like on January 6th to see a man in a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt storming the Capitol.
I know.
And
really
how the rhetoric of today in terms of anti-Semitism, but also in terms of racism, in terms of a refugee crisis, in terms of the way that we think about the world, what does it mean to you to have this story so unfold, and what is it meant to report it and tell it?
Yeah, it was definitely there in my mind. It was definitely the impetus to go to Germany with Sophie, with Charlottesville. I was so upset by that sort of the normalizing of Nazis marching in our streets. And then this question about monuments. And actually, when I first went to Germany, I was very much questioning this idea of keeping camps as memorial sites because of dark tourism and this sort of industry of, going to sites of suffering. And how do you do that? That's what my essay was going to be about. I was going to interrogate that kind of question. Anyway, I completely changed my mind about it. I think it's really important to keep these sites as pilgrimage sites and as bearing witness. Not to say that those are the only there's been many genocides, and and sadly there probably will continue to be. Like, it's not to say that this is the ultimate one, but just that it is what it's it happened in our time and in in Europe. And I just think it's really important. I thought, so that was the beginning. And I think then, what was I going to say? I was going to talk about, I lost my train of thought, but yes, the whole backdrop of the Trump era was pretty intense while I was writing this. Very painful. Also, what's interesting to me is that there was kind of like you see these things, there's the bell going back and forth. Like there's a point where everyone's like, never again. And you almost think, oh, not another Holocaust book, or haven't we told the story enough, and hasn't this on? And then, guess what? Like, no, it's like, the conspiracy theories with, Jews and anti-Semitism, it's the same tropes over and over again. We really, the stuff keeps coming back. It's not resolved. Like I said, I think it's partly of the intergenerational trauma. And I think, a lot of the traumatized people were not great parents, like it's sort of, it's a complicated, how do we heal ourselves? It's a complicated question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
I'm sad, but it makes sense.
Yeah. I found it I found the story hopeful in the end. Oh, sorry, I stepped on you, but I found the story hopeful in the end because of the solidarity that the women showed. Mm-hmm. But I also felt like there's, we're still in this place. We still have this this tendency as a human race.
Did you have a thing that you wanted people to take away from the book?
Well, yes, I wanted, I did really want people to understand how the women work together, and that survival was an act of solidarity, and that is sort of, to me, kind of a bit of what we need to learn, that for us to get through the next crises, we have to work together. And I also wanted to just, to offer up this kind of the bravery of these young women, like how they, they really were incredibly courageous, incredible fighters, soldiers, and they should be recognized as that. And I also thought, which was interesting for me in their journey, that, and my aunt also was very clear about this, that, it wasn't a goodies and baddies. Not all Germans were bad, It was a much more nuanced situation where common German people were also trapped in this terrible situation, in this terrible war. And I think that happens in all of these, I think you can take any of these types of problems, and you can see that a large part of the population is innocent in a way, and how do we, in Germany, the population was really not allowed to speak up, not allowed to, they were completely surveilled by the Gestapo and by the SS, and paranoid, and, suffering terribly as well. So it's an interesting, I want it to be more nuanced than just like there were these great, and the American soldiers weren't all great either, like then the Russians were complicated as well. I mean, they really suffer, just that idea that it's not a goodies, and it's not like there's not the good guys and the bad guys. It's really a complicated story. I hope.
So well through narrative, you keep introducing us to these different groups of people and showing us how different people in these groups respond. Some in humanitarian ways, some in predatory ways. It's I think it's remarkable. Well, I would love to open our conversation up to questions. So where it says "ask a question," in the bottom right corner, you can ask a question, or I can just, I can talk to Gwen about this all night, but I feel like there's a conversation that we would love to invite everyone into. And at the morning, right now, we just have a couple tech questions, which I hope is resolved at some point. But please, don't be shy. I'm a little intimidated by this book myself.
Oh, come on. Actually, if no one asks a question, then what I'm going to say is I want everyone to know that Lauren's book is coming out in paperback on Tuesday, right?
Thank you.
And it's right. This is all I got. It's a fabulous book, and her hardback. I read the hardback version. It's fabulous. It really, really, I want everyone to read it. It's an important story as well about housing and poverty and a single mom in New York. And
so this is classic Gwen. Is that what Gwen does? Is she brings artists together and she makes community and she wants to host the salon, but tonight she's in the hot seat. So ask her some questions already.
No, it's a great book, you guys.
So I think I've had most of this glass of wine. So I'm going to approach the question that I think I didn't want to ask last week, but this week is feeling hard to avoid. Which is, I've personally been struggling as an American Jew, as an American progressive secular Jew, obviously with what's happening in the movie right now. And it has felt profound to me to be reflecting on this book every day, as I have been aware that the stories in this book are the reason that is given for what is happening in our current crisis.
Yeah.
And even just a week ago, when I was thinking about the current applications of this book, there were so many of them. I mean, if they feel infinite right now, but they felt a little bit like Jewish adjacent. Felt like, yes, there is this rise of anti-Semitism, and I'm worried about that. But it also felt like there are larger racial crises at the moment, and then this moment happened.
Yeah,
and I wonder how you can help us understand, maybe through the frame of intergenerational trauma, how this narrative gets applied.
I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier. I think really, when traumatized people traumatize people, the oppressed becomes the oppressor. And that's kind of this great irony. I mean, look at World War I. Germany's defeated. They're humiliated. They're, they're really kicked to the curb. And what happens then? They rise. This like National Socialism sort of bullying party rises to power and justifies itself on this great crime that was done to them. And very, ridiculously, obviously, with the old trope of anti-Semitism. But I think that I personally feel like you have to separate, being for Israel and the state of Israel and Zionism, and I can make that distinction. It's true that when I was reading the book, and there was some sections when in Ravensbruck or even in Leipzig, when the women would learn about the beginning of Palestine, how exciting that was. Like someone smuggled in a newspaper that talked about that, and I can see, I was with them. Like that is, I get it. And also the refugee crisis after the war, there was nowhere for them to go, like that as well. Like, there's the French Jews, there were very few that survived. And there's descriptions of them coming home and they have nothing. They have nothing, their apartments, nothing. They have no money, no work, and they're not wanted. So I have great sympathy, obviously, for that, for needing a homeland. And then I also think that when you have a deeply traumatized, people, it's problematic on so many levels. And, it's heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking for me to see. I mean, I think, I think there's a line in my book about that a little bit.
That feels like the book that I read in a way that's very meaningful to me.
Right.
I appreciate that response. Lenora would like to know how your trip to Germany affected your relationship with your daughter, Sophie.
It was a really, actually, that was going to be part of my essay, because she and I were sort of arguing. She was much more radical than me, and she was sort of like, and we were having a sort of fight, kind of a fight. We were having discussion, a heated political discussion the whole time as we were going through this road trip about like, how does one engage in the to save the planet, to fight against fascism, to fight for human rights, and and I'm always sort of the one, because I'm the parent now, saying like, things are getting better, don't worry, and she's like, no, they're not good, so we had like this, and she's very intelligent too, so she was making good points, But I think when we both got to the camp, that was kind of like the, if I did the movie, that was really the turning point for both of us. It was a freezing day. I mean, absolutely freezing. We had warm coats, and we hadn't gotten anything to eat. So we actually felt like we were hungry, but we couldn't complain, like you can't complain, and you have to sort of go through it. And it was like this intense day, and it was just sort of stunned both her and I. And we came out of that. We sat down and had a long talk. I mean, our relationship is great, very lively. But it was for me. It was an important time for me to talk with her and to hear what she had to say about the future, and that was part of what I wanted to tell the story for my children too, because they have problems that they're going to have to face, and maybe this story can be part of that equipment, to help them.
Well, Patsy's wondering if you have other people in your family who share your passion for this story. And this
yes, I do. I have a lot of, my father is a historian, has been writing about his life in Dutchess County and on the farm. And my stepmother also is a historian, she's head of the Historical Society. And who else? My mother is an incredible storyteller, so I probably get that. I get my storytelling from her. And my children, 2 of them are talking about being writers, unfortunately. No, I joke. But
there's still time.
No, of course it's great. But yes, and also my aunt Ava, the one who went with me to record Podliasky. She's a real archivist. She's the real historic record keeper of the family. So yeah, it's genetic.
Kathleen was noting that your other books were of such different genres. I mean, you're a poet, you're a children's book author. She's wondering how you went about this mammoth project, which I think we've talked about a little bit, but I'm also very curious about how one jumps from writing in such shorter forms and such distilled forms into something that's such a saga. It's
bigger book. Well, I'm also a failed novelist, so I have several unpublished novels. So I have done the long project of writing a longer manuscript. And children's books. So I've written 3 children's books and a book of poetry. Children's books do take, even though they're short, they actually take a lot of work because of the really tight structure. So, but it's definitely a different kind of thing. I got to a point in my life where I just decided to write what I want to write. And then it's kind of a really great thing, actually, when you get older. You decide. You can just decide. And not to care as much about, whether, what happens next. You just write. And really, I cannot say how much it was a joy to write this book, even though it was a really dark and difficult subject. And there were times that it was hard to write. For example, all about the children in the camps, that was very difficult to write. But the actual research, the actual meeting the families, the actual figuring it out, plotting it out, working with my editor later, the whole process, the people that I met, has been just one happy thing for me. I loved writing this book. So that's the kind of experience I want to have.
Traumatized by it? It's so fascinating to me that you can have the experience of writing a book, which is just trauma on every page. Actually, that's not true. There's actually a lot of joy in this book as well. But have you felt like you've been carrying the trauma of the book?
Well, there were times when I had to put it down. There were times when the subject matter was just too dark and I had to go for a walk but actually writing about it is sort of how I processed it. It kind of was a way to, it was a way to help me figure it out a little, as much as one can. So, and just I know It's funny. My kids probably would say differently because, I for a while, I was pretty insufferable. Like every meal, any conversation, I would be, they would be talking about anything. And I would just like, oh, that reminds me. And it would be some Holocaust thing, which they'd be like, like, please don't. So, but I guess I feel like the process of writing it helped. There are things that I learned that I will never repeat and I won't write because I wish I didn't know them. There are things that I wish I hadn't read,
Mm-hmm.
And so, and there was some material that I cut. There was more, and there was even more material that then my editor helped me to cut. So we really dialed back some of the worst of it, I think. I tried to, yeah.
So Mary and Joe have a question, which I'm so glad they're posing to you and not me, which is, how can readers promote the position of women after this story? What do we do to it, Gwen? How do readers promote the position of women after this story? Mary's writing yay, but not like elucidating what she means by this. Mary's editor was at times, I am. Hi. So what do we do with this to make the world more equitable for women, right?
Well,
did I get that right? Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's what that means. I think again, like, it's the, telling the story. It's not keeping quiet, not being ashamed of women and what happens to them in war, not shaming them, not victimizing them, and recognizing that they had a really important role to play and that they did it, yeah.
I kept thinking reading the book that I felt like the book itself was an act of liberation, that you had freed up these stories, and in doing so, freed up us in a way. So, okay, one last question. I love this question. Gwen, will there be a television series?
Yeah, so there's
I think knows the answer. Maybe.
So there is, that's in the works. And I'm working with a really great, like super fabulous writer, Ella Hickson. She's writing the screenplay and working with a British production company called Kudos. They've optioned it and we'll see. But, these things are like, who knows, again, as I've gotten older, it doesn't matter. I just want to go back to writing.
Oh, come on, that matters. That matters so much.
It'll be good. It'll be nice if it happens, but
and
yeah, it'll be really nice.
Translated into French? Has it yet?
No, it's just really frustrating. No, it hasn't. I know it's been sold to a bunch of countries, 10, I think, or something like that, and all over. It's like all the countries around France. No, but France is they're difficult, I think.
You're still not French, even after decades. You're still not French for you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, and thank you, everybody.
Len now.
Well, I'd like to thank you both. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Lauren. Fantastic interview. Great questions. And thanks to all of our audience. Thanks for such an inspiring discussion. If you've not read this book, I have a feeling a lot of people in our audience have, but if you have not, signed copies of The Nine, as well as copies of This Is All I Got by Lauren Sandler, which will be signed, are available at oblongbooks.com. I'd also like to express our thanks to Dory Weintraub of St. Martin's Press, who helped make this event possible. And thank you to everyone who took the time out of your evening this evening to join us. We really appreciate it. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night and be well.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's lovely. Thanks, Lauren. Bye-bye.